Hi, everyone. My name is LaDonna Sanders Redmond, and welcome to Up and Coming. And this workshop or frame setting is called Why We Can't Wait. I named this workshop Why We Can't Wait, or this frame Why We Can't Wait, because I really was. Exploring the words of Dr. King. And I picked up the book, Why We Can't Wait. And so I've been thinking about the phrase, why we can't wait, given the fact that we are in the middle of a global plant pandemic, um, a national uprising, and seemingly a shift of thinking around racism in the United States. And we are all cooperators to some degree. And I believe that we can use cooperatives as a vehicle for reparations and for repair in our communities, specifically Black communities, but for all communities as well. So I decided to use the book Why We Can't Wait to frame this talk, and I'll be pulling some quotes from this book and just taking a walk through all of the reasons why we are the people we are waiting for, and we cannot wait on anything to find our liberation. And one of the things that we know we need is a cooperative economy. And so, kudos to all of you all who are starting co ops, who are running co ops. These things are the things that are necessary to building that solidarity economy. But first, I want to start off by honoring the land that I stand on. I am in Minnesota, in Minneapolis, and this is the traditional land of the Dakota people. And so I offer my gratitude to the land itself and to the people who've stewarded it throughout the generations, including the Ojibwe and other indigenous nations in this area. If you two would just join me and take a moment to honor the land itself and the people who stewarded it wherever you are, I would appreciate that. I also give thanks to my ancestors, those that were kidnapped from Africa and brought to this country, this world, far from their own language and their own culture and their own relatives. It is through them that I am able to be here today, and I'm ever so grateful for the ones that I know the names of, and history has swallowed the names of those that I don't know, and I honor them as well. So, why we can't wait. It was a fascinating title to me that during the time that he wrote this book, he was contemplating, and he wrote the book, if you don't know the history of the book. I didn't choose to go too deeply into that. Sorry. But this was a book that started as the letter from the it contains the letter from the Birmingham jail. And if you are familiar with that, then you'll know that Birmingham was really the epicenter of the civil rights movement, Alabama, actually. So if you get a chance, I highly recommend you read the book. But this is the first quote that I wanted to explore in this frame setting. For years now, I have heard the word wait. It rings in the ear of every Negro with piercing familiarity. This wait has almost always meant never. We must come to see with one of our distinguished jurists that justice too long delayed is justice denied. And so, this refrain that we have heard over and over and over again, I can't breathe, from little babies to our women and our men and our trans folks and non binary folks have all been in the position where they have not been able to breathe. And so while we have waited for justice to come, there's so many names to call that we have lost track of whose name to call when. So many have died saying, I can't breathe. And so we look for justice in the places where we know to look in our criminal justice system. And we finally find a place here in Minneapolis where the officer was convicted on all three counts. And we find that even in that conviction, there's no justice. There's relief, perhaps, fleeting, but relief, but not justice. Maybe even accountability. I don't know. Some people have said that. That's fine. But there is no justice there, just relief. And for me, I would say a gut feeling that we will be in this place again and again because nothing fundamentally has changed. And so, even as we look for justice, sometimes we look for justice in the victim. We want the victim to be a certain kind of person, sort of along the lines that the of the Montgomery bus boycott and Rosa Parks was like, the perfect person to go to jail. And so there was is this elaborate story about Rosa Parks being tired and she sat down and all of that. And of course, she later refuted that um, description of her seat, taking that seat on the bus to basically say, you know what, I had, I was tired of watching Black boys be lynched. She was upset. It's probably the weakest word that's coming to mind for me, but fundamentally disturbed by the murder of Emmett Till. And she decided to sit down that day. But they're no perfect victims, I guess is what I'm saying, and that's what this slide is saying. So we sometimes look for justice in the way that someone was killed or who it was that was killed and what they were doing when they were killed. And then none of it really matters, does it? Because at the end of the day, there's no perfect victim. They could have been doing all of the right things and been killed. So doing some of the wrong things, if you want to look at it like that, still gets you the same sentence. So there are no perfect victims as we seek justice. And in this seeking of justice, we have to realize that we've been waiting a long time for just this one moment to occur where a police officer is held accountable for the murder of a Black man. Hundreds and hundreds of years of waiting. Dr. King says 300 years of humiliation, abuse, and deprivation cannot be expected to find voice in a whisper. And so the protests and the uprising, the the fires, uh, all should be expected, actually, acknowledged as a way to say no, just no. Your work, a part of that uprising, is building cooperatives. And I'll talk more about this in a few slides, but one of the things that comes to mind is that we always want to talk about the things that tear the community down or hurt the community and never really characterize what comes up from the fire, the phoenix that comes up from the fire. And that's really what I believe cooperatives are doing right now. But diversity isn't enough, right? So we know that we have a strong criticism of contemporary co ops who are white led, serve white people, to some degree, might serve white people's food. And I use that in quotes because everybody eats food. But the way that co-ops have been brung forward hasn't invited people of color or people of culture into their spaces. And so now many of those co ops come to people like me and want to talk about diversity. And diversity is good, it's not enough. Diversity won't get us to justice. Angela Davis said, in a racist society, it's not enough to be non racist. We must be anti racist. And this is the key to what the organizations or cooperatives that are mainly white or white led have to understand. Even if you're in a community that you may say doesn't have any diversity, and I haven't found that place yet that doesn't have any diversity, I just want you to know that. But that place, wherever you are, you have to adopt an anti racist, anti oppression standpoint. Even if there's nobody around, so you say that fits the person that you're defending, because you're not really defending the other, you're doing it for yourself. Becoming an anti-racist and becoming an anti-oppressive cooperative, baking that in to your structure from day one is what is going to keep your structure safe. It's going to be a safe workplace. It's going to be a safe place to come and shop. It's going to be a safe place for the community, a safe haven for the community even, if you adopt an anti-racist or an anti-oppression lens. And so what is the difference that I'm making? Anti-racist, as you can see here, is the strategies, theories, actions, and practice that challenge and counter racism, inequalities, prejudice, and discrimination based on race. There's nothing wrong with that. If that's where you are, I'm here for you. I love it. And I want to offer you anti-oppression as an opportunity to work on race and work on ending socioeconomic oppression. And this really talks about regulating any possible oppressive practices in your workplace or in your cooperative and developing those practices that are inclusive and being consistent with the cooperative principles and the mutual and abolitionistic values that we all claim we hold. So there's a tall order on both sides. You pick your team, play on it, but understand this. We have to have a world that's free from oppression. If we're going to focus on race, then we're going to have to let race be the element that brings us up in terms of our standards to then talk about gender and sexual orientation and all of the other dimensions of culture that people bring into their workplace, into their community, and into their co op. So I've used this word a little bit, abolition. I want to introduce it a little bit more clearly because I call myself an abolitionist. Actually, I call myself a somatic abolitionist. And I think it's worth defining and discussing in the context of cooperatives. Abolition, or the abolitionist movement, was the movement to end slavery in the late 1800s. The abolitionists of the 18th century abolitionists believed that the slavery could not be fixed or reformed. It needed to be abolished. They were not about creating some, halfway point between freedom and enslavement. They wanted the end, complete end of slavery. And we should consider that the reforms that we can make to the prison industrial complex, I'm sorry I put pick there and didn't spell it out, the food system, um, or racism, just or effective. We have to consider that reforms aren't going to get us there. The goal is not to improve the system. Really, what we want to do is shrink the system into non existence and simultaneously bring forward an economy of solidarity. That's really what this is all about. So, in building a world free from oppression, we have to take on some stances, right? So, we're going to resist continued oppression. We're going to repair the harm. We're going to respond in ways that are supportive of community. I added rest here because so many times we don't take the time to rest. We just grind, grind, and grind some more. Um, and that is really part of the capitalist structure. So if we can really get rid of that grind culture and really incorporate rest, I think we'll be really well on our way to oppression. I just know so many activists that have worked themselves to death, literally, um, and it just really doesn't push the movement forward. So incorporate rest in your anti-oppression work or in your liberation work, and then of course there's restoration and reparations. The international cooperative principles give us a framework to begin to talk about abolition because this organizing structure that we have, one, is based on community. So what you see here is really about how a co-op works in general. You have owners, they elect a board. The board manages someone who runs the co-op, or maybe you have a worker on co-op and your structure will look a little bit different. But basically, there's a manager or series of managers or workers who are going to serve those owners. And you're going to do all of that in somewhat of a legal structure and a social movement. And they're going to overlap. And that is what is, really important about the co-op, right? It has a legal structure, and we haven't left our social movement behind. And so we want to continue to do our business, but we also want to remember that our business is really about putting forward the international principles, understanding around, our clear understanding around anti-racism and anti-oppression. I oftentimes don't think that the 12 international principles say enough along those lines, that people can interpret them to be inclusive of those principles, and I'll go along with that for now. But our co ops really have a unique place, they have a unique opportunity to be that social business, but also to be that business that is really about promoting liberation. A social movement that only moves people is merely a revolt. A movement that changes both people and institutions is a revolution. And that's really what's up, right? We're talking about a revolution. And we're talking about the way that cooperatives have used abolition of enslavement or oppression as a way to move from enslavement to cooperation and use cooperation as a vehicle to do that. When we look at the Rochdale pioneers, I'm laughing because I remember the first time I saw this picture and I was like, yet again, another picture of white men who are the owners of something. But as I started to really question who they were and what they did, I found out that they were some white men who were really I would like to say that they were ahead of their time, but I really don't believe that. They were right men. They were men and women who were part of the Rochdale Society of Equitable Pioneers. Um, they were people who thought along the principles that they said they believed in, and those principles that they believed in included them taking a stance against slavery and refusing to purchase slave cotton or cotton from the South, if you will, and also supporting Frederick Douglass as he sought his freedom from enslavement. I thought this was really important because what they decided to also do was not just make that decision and kind of let it be and didn't tell anybody about it. They talked to their owner members and they talked to their community about abolition. And they were firm believers of abolition, so much so that they changed the language in one of their documents to say, all people, all brothers, everyone is our brother. And these are important ideas for 1844, where, they're at near the end of enslavement, and they're looking to continue their own business, and they're hungry themselves. The Industrial Revolution is taking advantage of them. And as weavers, they need to get cotton, and they need to get it now, and they need to get it as inexpensively as possible. But yet they decide to say no to cotton coming from the South of the United States. But even prior to the Rochdale pioneers, um, the folks in the United States, Africans, free Africans, were organizing a form of resistance known as mutual aid societies. One of the oldest is the African Methodist Episcopal, the Free African Society, which later became the AME Church, or the predecessor of the AME Church. I shouldn't say that. The founder of the AME Church was also a part of the mutual aid. There was also another gentleman that I came across named David Ruggles. He owned the first Black-owned bookstore in New York. He was a conductor on the Underground Railroad, and he was one of the few conductors that was visible. Many of the people involved in the Underground Railroad did so anonymously, for their own safety, and also for the safety of the cargo, the newly liberated Africans. But he is the one who met Frederick Douglass. If you read his autobiography, Frederick Douglass left the South and ended up in New York, and this is who he ran into, and this is who he's talking to, who tells him to go further north in New York and build his life there. David Ruggles was probably the proponent of, the first fair trade program, because he also was a big proponent of the free produce movement, which means to encourage people to buy products that were free from the stain of slavery. So he also promoted that strongly. He was also a person who they talk a lot about in a book called The Kidnap Club. He was really very strong advocate against these folks who went around trying to catch free um, Africans who were in New York, and they would just kind of round them up and hold them against their will and then ship them back south. And he was known to, go in and make sure that people did not do that, make sure that those folks were let go. He argued cases in court, and also got people who had been captured free. He believed in what he called practical abolition. And so I was talking about the kidnapping clubs, to help those folks that were fugitives, and to force folks to let them go when they had kidnapped them. And he formed the New York Committee of Vigilance. So this became a template for lots of societies that were trying to really form these self-emancipation clubs for people who were newly liberated. And this is a picture of Mother Harriet Tubman, and this resistance to being enslaved was really about believing that they had the right to be free, but they were fit to be free. And I think that's really such an important phrase that I ran across: fit to be free. And not fitness, like, lifting weights or running or whatever, but that as a human being, you are sovereign, and that you have no one has to give you the right to be free. You were born that way. So, fit to be free was really something that I feel is a big part of the resistance movement. The other part of the resistance movement is Ida B. Wells. And many of us know her as the proponent of the end of lynching, and her work around anti lynching began in Memphis in the Curve. And um, when her friends were lynched as a part of the People's Grocery Store. Um, I'm not going to really go too deeply into the story. I just want you to know that this legacy of standing up through cooperation is prevalent in the history of African Americans. And if you don't know that by now, you should. And if you don't know it today, here you are learning it. But I want to really just impress upon you that this history of abolition and cooperation go together. Excuse me, I was say Frederick Douglass. This is W.E.B. Du Bois, who we all know did that pivotal study of cooperation among Black folks in the late 1800s. And he found out that the role of social clubs was around shared values and faith. I'm sorry, I just changed language, and I'm going to explain to you what I mean by social clubs. They found physical and psychological support, and they had a bunch of fun and fellowship, and it was also about social change. So what I meant to change the slide a little bit, so I apologize for that. But this role of social clubs was really another way to talk about mutual aid and cooperation. So while we have this formal structure of cooperation, right? You can have a legal structure, and you might have a business, or most of you all are starting grocery stores, that there are other aspects of your grocery store, which are the association, right? The enterprise is the business, but you also have an association. And so, thinking about your association, much like the way these folks thought about their social clubs, could give us a key to how to really facilitate owner engagement in our cooperatives, rather than just say, okay, well, yeah, they're coming to shop, and we hope they come and shop. We want them to come and shop. But there's also much more value in the association than just coming to shop. And I don't want to minimize that at all, because without shoppers at a grocery store, you're done. But you want to facilitate the shared value and the support, the psychological and physical support, and the fellowship and fun. And of course, community change or social change. So these are just a few of the pamphlets that we found here in Minneapolis and St. Paul from one of the early social clubs called Crediphone Social Club, and this is a brochure from 1934. Um, they did a bunch of stuff. They had a credit union. They had parties where they got together. And this is important because in 1934, there wasn't very many places that Black folks could get together. And so what they used to do would be to get the members of the club who were light enough to pass for white to go negotiate contracts at hotels so that they could all have their Christmas parties and things like that. So many of the facilities became integrated, whether they liked it or not, because they were able to, manipulate the system to be able to protect each other and have fun. And they had their recreational fun, and they did their events, and they had a credit union, but they also opened up a grocery store. I love this picture of the guy with the fresh chicken, and you see a little chicken feet in the back. The Orisha priest in me digs this picture a lot. And then there's the Progressive Club in 1948. So the Progressive Club, one of the organizers, founders, if you will, is Esau Jenkins. And this was a really important store as well. They had a grocery store, but they had a credit union too. But in the back of their grocery store, they had a little room that they used to do some work around self-determination. And basically, it was the early iterations of the citizenship schools. That's Septima Clark was also a part of that work. So as we get through the 1960s and civil rights, and if you've heard me talk about this before, then you know where I'm going with this. is that our work has always been around this right to public accommodation, being treated with dignity wherever we go. And so being able to eat someplace and being able to eat out, we know is really vitally important. I mean, in COVID-19, the closure of restaurants has just kind of set people aback because it's so much a part of how we socialize and how we enjoy ourselves. We enjoy ourselves over food. And being able, having a society that's able to deny you the right to eat out is really something else, right? It's something to push back against because it's not about the food, really, it's about dignity. So, as you are thinking about your work and what you want to do, think about it being about as much about dignity as it is about access to food. And everywhere I look in our history, I find that folks were trying to sit someplace, eat, or get something to drink, and they would bump into these Jim Crow laws that said, hey, you can't do that. You're black. We don't serve black people here. One of our recently heroes that has transitioned is John Lewis, who is also a part of the civil rights movement, as you well know, and part of abolition. John Lewis is seen in this picture, which happens to be one of the most known pictures that really does depict the violent racism that was going on in Selma, Alabama. But as you look throughout the throughout the civil rights movement, you find these folks who have a commitment to cooperatives and liberation simultaneously. So I mentioned September Clark, the founder of the Freedom Schools. She was also one of the folks with Esau Jenkins in that food co-op in the back room, learning how to help, helping each other to help themselves. And they started that progressive club in 1958. And then our beloved, elder Mother Ella Baker was also a big part of co-ops, working with the Young Negro Cooperative League, and then going into the NAACP to teach about cooperatives all over the country. And she also was a part of the Cooperative League of the USA, which is the NCBA Calusa now. And Ella Baker was first staff person of SCLC. And then, of course, you have Baynard Rustin here, known as the organizer of the March on Washington, and some people say the architect of the civil rights movement. He lived in a cooperative apartment, as did A. Philip Randolph and lots of other folks in the movement. And his apartment at Penn South was the first meeting to organize the March on Washington. And I don't want to overlook the fact that, of course, he was later kind of pushed to the back because of his sexuality, or shunned because of his sexuality. Um, Throughout this work, we see mutual aid, building solidarity during crisis over and over again, but not just staying stuck in a crisis, really looking to the solution, coming in with the repair work, being able to feed kids who were hungry, being able to get elders the food, being able to start hospitals and get people medical care has always been a part of mutual aid and cooperation. This revolution is genuine because it was born from the same womb that always gives birth to massive social upheavals, the womb of intolerable conditions and unendurable situations. Racism cannot be separated from capitalism. I don't know what else to say. Angela Davis said it. It's nothing else to really say that can add to that. Racism cannot be separated from capitalism because it's all connected. You can pretty much, if you wanted to like take capitalism out, you could put white supremacy in the center there, and then you would still have this ripple effect of interactions that create these negative outcomes. I'm sorry, this is so blurry. I've tried to work on this slide a lot, and I just really couldn't get it the way that I wanted it, and perhaps I should have taken it out. But I really wanted you to see, that many of the products that you're going to have in your store are they appear to be independent, but the reality is that we have about 10 companies here that will provide 90% of the food that's in your store. And that's an old slide. And so the consolidation in the food system still continues to go forward. And that consolidation continues to drive exploitation in the food system because the players aren't these, new upstart organic food companies. These are the same food companies that are big proponents of genetically modified food and other kinds of conventional food and farming techniques that are harmful to the environment and harmful to the health and well-being of the folks in our communities. Laminate, my mouth isn't going to work today. It is a historical fact that privileged groups seldom give up their privileges voluntarily. Individuals may see the moral light and voluntarily give up their unjust posture. But as Reinhold Niebuhr has reminded us, groups tend to be more immoral than individuals. So we can't really depend on everybody to come along, right? We still have to ask for the things that we want. We have to demand the things that we want. And so right now, 21st century abolitionists are starting to demand the defunding of the police and the abolishing of the police. And really, that's just like a little bitty piece of what abolition is about, right? Because it's not just about tearing things down. It's really about what the vision is. And really the vision is a world free from oppression or people living in liberation. But if you call yourself an abolitionist, it can't just be about the police. It has to be about human trafficking and cheap labor, of course the prison industrial complex, which is a continuation of enslavement in this country. And so what I want to point out to you is that as people who are looking to build workplaces that are free from racism, free from oppression, that we have to really look at the bottom of the pyramid here. It's easy for us to just focus at the top and say, oh my God, genocide is terrible, violence is terrible, cause for violence is terrible, and then just kind of get, glossy eyed when we start to talk about discrimination, anti-race, anti-immigration policies, racial profiling, when we start to talk about veiled racism, cultural appropriation, racist iconography, Eurocentric curriculums, tokenism, or when we start to talk about minimization, using the phrase not all white people or all lives matter, not believing that Black folks and Indigenous folks and other people of culture have these experiences that are racist and they're harmful. Um, Denying that white privilege even exists. And it's not really a phrase that I use a lot. I tend to use that, white bodied supremacy doesn't exist, or that you don't have that supremacy as an individual because you grew up a certain kind of way. And of course, indifference, which is at the base of this pyramid. The point that I'm making to you is that we tend to normalize those things that are at the base of the pyramid. I don't. I'm saying we, to be generous. But those of you who do normalize indifference and minimization are co-conspirators with mass murder and violence and genocide, because you have to have a base of a pyramid to have a tip of the pyramid. And so what we have to do at the very basic, basic level is to rid ourselves of indifference when it comes to the harm that anyone is experiencing. If we want to avoid the continuation of white supremacy. We're going to have to call ourselves out on indifference. We're going to have to call, and I'm saying our because me in a black body, I am not obviously white, but white supremacy has impacted me. And if I'm not careful, I'll be saying crazy things about other people who are different from me. I have to have an anti oppression standpoint in order to see other people free. If I want to be free, and I do want my own liberation, I got to be down for the liberation of all people. So that's the we. I'm not talking about that I'm white when I say we, but I don't want us to miss for 1 second that sometimes we all contribute to our own marginalization. And so, to that degree, we want to make it abnormal to be indifferent in these conversations where we have to confront someone about them saying something or doing something that is offensive. We have to learn how to be interrupters of racism and gender bias and genderphobia, transphobia, whatever the case may be. We have to learn how to interrupt it. And sometimes we just don't have the conflict resolution language to do that. But I want you to think for just one moment what it means not to do it. What does it mean to feel like you have to protect yourself on your way to work every day? Excuse me. That you have to devote your time and energy to consciously preparing to face the foolishness of the world related to your race or your gender or your religion or your skin color. And when you realize that every day has this potential for large and small acts of exclusion or discrimination, you just really understand that folks pay a huge emotional tax just to be ready to deal with society. This stuff requires our constant as a Black woman. It requires my constant, not occasional vigilance. I'm constantly on guard for these large and small acts of exclusion or discrimination. Now, some people might call them microaggressions. I'm not really going to go into the whole thing around microaggressions. That's a whole nother workshop. But I'm just really calling out to you this big category where this heavy lift has to come from Black and brown people and other people of difference when they come into a workplace that is not in an anti-racist, anti-oppression stance. You don't want to create more trauma. You want to be a place of refuge. So in your policies, your practices, and your procedures, you don't want to wait and you don't want to ask anybody else to wait. So don't have anybody waiting on you to do the right thing in your co op. I want to point out one particular way that we need to work on um, anti racism and anti oppression, and specifically talk about racialized sexism that Black women face. Miss Senor is a important term to learn. It's important work to do because it is the intersection of racism and sexism that create these racist tropes around Black women. I'm talking about this because so many of the folks that I have seen at the Up and Coming conference have been Black women. And I want to make sure that our spaces, our up and coming cooperative spaces, are free from racism and sexism too. As our sisters are coming in with this burden of having to stand in the intersection of race and class and gender, we have to really take a good look at the sexualization of Black women and girls based on racism. And we have to make sure that our workplaces are free from sexual harassment. This this particular kind of sexual harassment, though, is really kind of baked into society, right? It's because Black women and girls are always stereotyped or have been stereotyped to be overly sexualized. And this is something that came from the Europeans who were going to Africa and bringing Black women back, or bringing African women along with them as they kidnapped them and bring them to the United States and South America. And this is the way that they described African women as being over sexualized. And so this was used to justify their rape. And this particular um, trope, if you will, is used to dismiss the allegations of sexual assault or abuse or harassment of Black girls and teens. So, in practice, these are just a few of the ways that Miss Senor is perpetrated on Black women. In some of the public health fields, it's where doctors perceive that Black women have higher pain thresholds. That really comes out of the work of Marion Sims, who was or is the founder of gynecology, and his projects and his research were done on Black women's bodies in hopes of finding cures for diseases that white women had, and he would experiment on their bodies without anesthesia. And so his premise was that Black women have higher thresholds. Um, the other piece of this is that Black women are viewed as threatening or angry whenever they speak up for themselves. So these are just a few things. The stereotype of the strong Black woman, that Black women aren't allowed to feel or have emotional pain or distress, things like that. All I'm offering to you all right now is an opportunity to take something into practice in your co-op organizing, to be sure that you are laying a base that is anti-racist, anti-oppressive for all people. Is it a heavy lift? Absolutely. I know you're doing a lot of stuff. You're raising money. You're thinking about your co-op. You're thinking about your food. But you also have to be thinking about this as a workplace, a safe workplace for everybody. So the tasks of folks that are in white bodies, these are some things that you can do. Resist notions of equality. Don't equate suffering. Make your intentions and your impact match. You can't, your good intentions don't negate consequences. I'm just going to point out one more. I don't want to run over too much here. It says develop a thick skin. That white fragility will get you every time. You're going to have to let that go. But I also want you to challenge yourself to to look for ahistorical perspectives. History matters. Don't try to dismiss the past and say that the past doesn't affect the future, or somehow make people pick between whether we're going to talk about the past or whether we're going to go forward. We have to do both. And so the way forward for me has been somatic abolition. So to transform society, we have to transform ourselves. This work has to happen also in community. We cannot do it alone. As you know, you can't do a co-op by itself. So the element of mutual aid in cooperation really go together, because it's really about building solidarity. Nobody is trying to give anybody anything, and this is not so much to say that philanthropic giving is bad or anything like that, but really it's about self-determination at the end of the day. And so 6 outcomes for somatic abolition here are, really understanding how chronic oppression can create unsustainable and understandable, like, reactivity, right? People being upset, being off balance, off kilter, tired, overworked, paying an emotional tax. But the somatic abolition works gives us an opportunity to learn some practices to metabolize oppression. And we also understand that we have to explore that hardwired survival strategy in our bodies, because when we are chronically triggered, we don't know how to build our communities. And so when we bring in people together, we want to stay together. And so we got to work on our stuff that keeps us apart. We can look for individual and collective strategies to create conditions which metabolize trauma through the body. And we can anchor liberation through embodied resilience practices. And then lastly, we have to unpack the somatics of privilege. And so, what we're building when we do that is a window of resilience. I crossed out the word tolerance because I think that's, a little patronizing and condescending. It's really about resilience, building a threshold where we can deal with activation and find settling in the same, in a rhythm, right? The words bad timing came to be ghost haunting our every move in Birmingham. Yet people who used this argument were ignorant of the background of our planning. They did not realize that it was ridiculous to speak of timing when the clock of history showed that the Negro had already suffered 100 years of delay. And so we don't have any more time to wait. That's why we can't wait. We out of time. Somatic abolition is a living anti-racist, anti-oppressive practice. I have the book here, My Grandmother's Hands by Resma Menakem. If you don't have it, you need to get it and read it because racialized trauma is really the way forward. Understanding racialized trauma is really the way forward to mending our communities or healing ourselves in our communities. And that other meme says, don't share, Dr. King's word, do what he says do, right? Do the work. Um, if you look at every age, it says here it has its evil, and every age has its abolitionist. And so this is a time to become an abolitionist and to reimagine our communities, our cooperative communities, as living in liberation. And I say reimagine because I don't think we vision far enough in the future, if we vision at all. We have to really envision our liberation and that our communities, our co op communities, are places to learn and unlearn. And that's all I have. Thank you so much for watching this. And I look forward to being with you all soon. I hope that you're safe and healthy and well and taking good care of yourself. That's all I got. Thanks a lot. Bye bye.